Well, thanks very much for a really clear introduction of both the topic and ourselves. Perhaps what I can start with is say a few words about why we are here today. And first, one thing that unites us, I'm talking about Julia and I, but I would assume more of the people who are here with us this afternoon, is that we want to create a more sustainable world through behavior change. That's the mission that we are sort of giving ourselves. But let's unpack that for a moment. So the first thing to say about that is that changing behavior is essential to a more sustainable world. At least that's our perspective, but not just our perspective. There's quite a lot of research and numbers to back that up. And it's even been quantified. So depending on the scenarios, for instance, if we talk about CO2 emission, behavior solutions have a potential to contribute to between 20 and 40% of reducing CO2 emissions. So what we are talking about a significant contribution to reducing CO2 emissions and therefore having a positive impact on fighting climate change. Another way to look at it is to talk about the complementarity between technical solutions and behavioral solutions. So what we mean by that is technical solutions would be things like putting a new law in place or product innovation, which obviously are extremely important. There are fundamental ways to help solve the climate crisis. But in many situations, there won't be enough for to drive the right change in what people ultimately do. And perhaps a couple of examples. If you take vegetarian meat on one side, or using less water when having a shower. In both these cases, the product solution, the product innovation is there. You can have like showers that reduce water consumption, or obviously in supermarkets today you have vegetarian meat alternatives. So the product alternative is there, the technology is there, but it doesn't mean that people use them as much as we would like them to. In both these situations as well, producing a new law would be quite unproductive. It would be quite difficult to create a law that forces people to eat less meat or to reduce, to give them like a specific time for the duration of their shower. So we have to rely on other types of solutions to influence people's behavior. And that's very much what we mean by behavioral solutions. We are going to talk about that a bit more. The good thing is that more and more organizations understand the need to develop behavioral solutions besides technical ones. There was a recent survey of European CEOs, and they identified what they call leading the consumer, so influencing consumer behavior, as the #2 priority at the European level to get us to a better place in terms of sustainability and climate change. It's also a discussion that's become more and more central in the non-profit world. There was a survey, I think it was last year or early or end of the year before, by the CSCP, which is the Collaborating Center on Sustainable Consumption and Production. And they were asking the question about, do you think that changing citizen behavior has a major role to play in tackling climate change? And the vast majority of NGOs agreed with that statement. So the condition seems to be there more and more. Now the challenge is how we can get to help as many organizations as possible, which is quite an important point to make as well. At the end of the day, we need as many of us as possible to contribute to fighting climate change if we want it to work. If we only have a small percentage of organizations and therefore individuals who make an effort, it's not going to be sufficient for us to come to a better place. And one way to see it from an organization perspective is as it shows on that sort of a chart, is some organizations will be more on the right, which is they will have a lot of resource to work on changing behaviors and producing solutions to fight climate change. Let's say, for instance, a government. And with a lot of resource come also the challenge that, there is a lot at stake. So they need to make sure it's extremely precise and they have the right solution in place. On the other end, lots of organizations which might be much smaller with much less resource. We also want to be able to help these organizations because at the end of the day, the benefit they have being a smaller organizations is that there is perhaps less at stake. They can perhaps a bit more easy than a government, for instance. Perhaps it's a bit more easier for them to perhaps test and learn and see what works and adapt over time. But on both sides of that spectrum, solutions exist to help organizations encourage sustainable behaviors. And so that's what we want to talk about in the next couple of sections. And we thought quite a simple way to talk about it was based on that quote from Subir Chowdhury, which is a senior advisor to governments and NGOs, who talks about the fact that quality combines people power and process power. And at the end of the day, that's what we need, all of us, to put in place behavior solutions. We need the right expertise and we need the right tools. So Julia is going to talk about the first part of the equation, the expertise and the people, and then we will talk about process and tools. Julia.
Yes, thanks, Fred, and hello, everyone. I haven't said hello, so hi. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you a bit more about this complementarity of expertise between science and practice. So what we call here the people power. So basically, I'm just going to talk you through three different stages at which we can see this complementarity of expertise between scientist and practitioner, and how this can actually be useful to design interventions that are in line with both scientific insights on climate change, but that also have an impact on people's behavior. Because as Fred mentioned, our objective is to motivate behavior change that will help reach the necessary targets to reduce climate change. So I'm going to start with the first stage that we call relating to climate change. And here there is a complementarity of time perspective, let's say. So on one hand, you've got science, which usually approach climate change from a long-term perspective, which is absolutely necessary to provide future projection and estimation. We do need that. And science was also subjected to a more long-term process. So the research process in itself is quite long. From the moment you get funding to the moment you actually publish your results, it takes quite a long time. So you have this long-term perspective on one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got a more short-term focus. You've got businesses and policymakers who often tend to set short-term targets and aim for immediate actions. And that makes sense because for policymakers, it's all related to the short political turnover that kind of prevents deeper societal transformation. And for businesses, it's more that they are usually reluctant to invest in long-term solutions when they have no direct financial benefits. And this short-term lens, which is criticized often as short-termism, you might have heard this term before, can lead businesses and policymakers to ignore future long-term implications of climate change. And that does not really motivate effective action. So we need to remind these people of the whole long-term implication of this. The problem is that currently most scientific reports, and that includes the IPCC, do not really consider these needs of decision maker to make a key and immediate action. So they don't really formulate any appropriate response to climate change that you can actually put into practice. And these reports are mainly aimed at policymakers, but they are also very useful to us as practitioners. So there is a need to see how we can modify this a bit. And in addition to all this short-term view of climate change is also a second nature to us as individuals. And this is very interesting. It's interesting for us at Behavioural, talking about changing behavior change. We consider people's nature. And people are actually quite short-term orientated. This is due to a bias that we call psychological distance, which implies that we are basically more interested in the present than in the future, in what impacts us rather than what impacts others, and in what is near rather than what is far. And as you can imagine, this is quite problematic with climate change because the impact of climate change, even though they're seen nowadays in our countries, they will be most obviously seen, let's say, in the future. And its real impact is actually happening in countries that are far away from us. So the thing is, for people, the larger the distance to a problem is, the more abstract the mental representation of the problem becomes. So climate change starts to become kind of an abstract thing for people. So basically, the challenges that climate change poses for us as a society are tricky because they are both long-term and urgent. And that's where we need a more holistic approach to make sure that we implement these short-term improvements without falling too much into incrementalism, but still consider the long-term implication of all of that. So moving on now to the second stage, which is the implementation of solutions to climate change. And here again, you've got a complementarity between general research and contextual application. So basically, research brings us a theoretical knowledge that's useful to us to understand the mechanism that drives our behaviors. But when it comes to pre-environmental behaviors, and actually for many other types of behaviors, the fact is that research remains weird. So that's just an acronym. I'm not just saying that research is weird. And that means that research is often conducted on white educated population living in industrialized, rich and democratic countries. And a recent study actually from this year showed that 73% of the studies on pro-environmental behaviors are actually conducted in America and in Europe. So you can see that we're missing a large proportion of the world here. So if we want to implement this research, we need to consider the context and we need to consider the audience that we are targeting before putting this research into practice. And for climate change, it's really important because research has shown that engagement with climate change is actually affected by people's value and by their lived experiences. So there is a need to translate this general research into more contextual application. And that's actually even more important when it comes to behavioral science and applied behavioral science, because there is a tendency in this field to assume that intervention are one size fits all, that they can be applied universally to lots of different contexts. So for example, you've got nudging and nudges that you probably heard about, which are very useful tools to change behavior. They became really popular after the publication of the book by Thaler and Sestine in 2008. And so you could see lots of what they call nudge units appearing all over the world and in different governments. And that was great because it was a way to bring behavioral science to policymakers. But the thing is, recent research is starting to question the effectiveness of nudges. And we're actually starting to realize that these tools cannot really be applied everywhere and to all settings. So we need to make sure that we tailor everything to the people we're targeting to make sure that we apply this research correctly. Oops, sorry, just moving back if I can. Yes. Yeah, second thing I wanted to mention on the implementation of solution is the complementarity between small-scale finding and real-world insights. So to start with, social science research and even research on environmental behaviors is usually conducted on small-scale studies, in labs, and on very specific populations. So you can see lots of studies conducted, for example, on university students. And that's where practitioners have an opportunity to test these insights from science. So usually what we found in the future work section of academic papers, to test this into real world settings. And another thing that practitioners can add to that is the fact that they can actually bring insights from different disciplines together. And that's actually crucial because climate science so far remains quite disciplinary. So you have engineers doing their bit on their side, social scientists doing their bit on their side, and no communication going on between them two. So we have an opportunity as practitioners to bring these great disciplinary insights together to form better interventions. And then once that's done, to develop the field and extend our knowledge of sustainable behaviors, practitioners have an opportunity to feed back the information they found on people and on decision makers to scientists through, for example, public reports. So you've got organizations like RARE, which is one of the leading organizations in terms of behavior change and conservation, who is publishing reports and making everything public for the benefits of scientists, of policymakers, and that's what really practitioner could be about. There is also actually a case for applied behavioral science to inform even official reports like the IPCC, for example, which could actually incorporate more practitioners as author to improve the understanding of the decisions that are made when it comes to climate change. So to conclude on this, basically, research on climate change forms the necessary background that we need to build and test our behavior change intervention. And combining insights from both science and practice can then help us understand and find the best way to modify people's behavior to respond to the necessary targets. Moving on to the last stage, which is communicating solutions to climate change. Here again, you have a complementarity between science and practice. You have on one hand the big picture, and opposed to that, or complementary to that, you've got personal emotions and experiences. So here, again, we can see that the method of communication actually vary. There is what we can call a mismatch between message and messenger, and that comes down to a difference in personalities between climate scientists and the general population. So actually a study in 2012 tried to test the personality types of PhD climate scientists using the Myers-Briggs test, which is a very famous personality test that you might have heard of, that basically assess your personality based on 4 different scales and give you a specific type of personality. And I think they have a range of 18 personality types, I think. So they use this method to test the personality of climate scientists. And they actually found that climate scientists tend to lead towards intuition, which is a personality trait that lead people to pay attention to the meaning, the patterns of information, but also to focus on theories and the big picture. But then they compared that to the result they got for the average general public, and that was in the US. And they found that the average US population tend to lean towards the opposite of that, which is sensing, which means that they pay more attention to the physical reality and they focus on concrete examples and experience. And so all of this has implication for the way scientists communicate information, because climate change is often studied in statistical terms. They tend to communicate information about the bigger picture through statistics and abstract terms. And they then assume that this information will be processed by everyone in a very analytical and logical way. But the fact is that actually most people, because they lean towards this sensing aspect of the personality, trust more their past experience than future possibilities. And experiences are actually found to be a very powerful teacher when it comes to motivating action on climate change. And similarly to that, actually, in addition to experience, there's lots of research recently being done on emotions and the impact of emotion on risk perception and adaptation behaviors. So that's 2 aspects of personality that are crucial if we want to encourage people to adopt more sustainable behaviors. So there is a need to translate this bigger picture that scientists provide, and that is actually crucial to understand climate change issue, into communication that relate to concrete experiences and that can have an emotional impact on people. And for example, that can be done through storytelling. Storytelling is a great way to engage the emotional brain, to elicit hope and pride. And it's particularly useful to use stories that can remind us of past experience, but that can also inform people about personal stories related to climate change. And actually, storytelling is also a good way to involve individuals in the research process, because scientists tend to communicate only once they got their results published, and that can take quite a while. So there is a need to make people understand more about the science process in itself, and the fact that uncertainty should be communicated. And it's important that they have to understand what is still being studied instead of having direct results. In addition to all this, there's also a difference in the way communication takes place. So usually communication from scientists is really a one-way communication, with scientists informing the general public. Practitioners, depending on the intervention then put in place, can have an opportunity to actually create more of a dialogue and a two-way conversation with citizens, and that can have a better impact on people. And a final point on this is the complementarity between roles, actually, between informing and motivating. So scientists and practitioners have very different roles to start with. And we have a quote here just under the picture from Bob Ward from the Grantham Institute in London, which actually illustrates this quite well. He says that our primary aim as a research institute is to inform, not to motivate. And actually, it's true that there is no real consensus about the role of scientists in changing people's behavior when it comes to climate change. So we had a workshop organized, I think it was in 2018, by Climate Outreach in the UK, which is an organization in the UK, that showed that there was actually disagreement on whether climate communication should be aimed at behavior change, whether it came from academics or practitioner. But everybody, so both academics and practitioners, seem to agree on the fact that it is important to encourage people to take action in their own lives to limit climate change. So on the one hand, you've got the scientists who basically only engage in public communication when they need to educate the public, so for educational purposes, or when there is a need to defend science from communication. So they don't tend to engage in public conversation for more than this. Even though actually, to be fair, recently there is a move towards effective communication. You can see projects like the Climate Change Communication Project in the UK that's bringing both scientists and practitioners together to communicate about this issue. So there is a move towards this. But practitioners, and that includes also policymakers and authorities who have more experience in communication and behavior change intervention, and whose role is actually to motivate, can ease that transition and can almost act as science translators to make sure that science reaches people and touches them and ultimately motivates them to change their behavior. So knowing all this, and that's a lot of information, I think we're going to tell you more now. Fred will tell you more now on how you can actually, knowing all this, put all this together to design an efficient intervention. So Fred, I'll leave you the screen.
Thanks, Julia. Whoops, I'm clicking in the wrong direction. There you go. Yes, so what we want to do in the next section is basically take you behind the scene and show you how we do it, knowing that, keep in mind that, behavioral science is still a very young field, and therefore the way we use it, and as a result, it evolves, and the way we use it evolves as well. So we've noticed that it's almost like from project to project, we've been able to have a better, we get to know new information, new research, new tools that we can use. And so the notion of constant innovation is very much, how we tend to use these things. But what you have in this section is a pretty good and complete view of how you can then implement a behavior change, campaigns or programs. A question that you might have been asking yourself is, where do I start? There's all of these theories and models. What am I going to do with all of this? And as an example, if you look at that book of ABC of Behavior Change Theories, you can see that they refer to more than 80 of them, which might be a bit confusing to say the least. So when we were at that point, we ask ourselves, okay, how are we going to decide? And so we made a decision to focus on a very, very small number of tools based on their, I would say, quality or robustness, how scientifically robust they are. Are they going to help us to focus on not just insights, but interventions as well? And are they adaptable in the sense that you might remember a slide from a few minutes ago, we were talking about, high stakes, lots of resource, lower stakes, less resource. Are they going to work in that different, in these two types of context? We ended up selecting two models that we work mostly with. One which is the BMAP model, and the other one which is the COMBI model. And one way to think about how we use them is they are mostly useful in different types of context, whether it's a more or less project complexity. I'm going to go into a bit more details about that. So on one side, BMAP. BMAP has been developed by a scientist called BJ Fogg. He works at Stanford University in the US in what used to be called a persuasion lab, which I believe now has been changed to a behavior change lab or something. And that model works really well if you're in context persuasion. So the model actually historically comes from you know, as you know, Stanford is close to, you know, Silicon Valley, and there's been a lot of effort by the likes of Facebook, for instance, to use persuasive technology to influence people's behavior. That's very much the history and the context of where that model is coming from. But in its nature, it's flexible and it can work in many more contexts. And that one is based on the notion that you need a sufficient degree of motivation and ability at the same moment, combined with a prompt to encourage a behavior. So let's say, for instance, that you've created a new mobile app that's designed to encourage people to find, you know, vegetarian restaurants in the area, for instance. It might be a good model for that sort of context. Or a context where you're going to focus mostly on a very executional, single-minded sort of intervention. On the other end of the spectrum, a model like, oops, let me try and click that correctly. On the other end of the spectrum, a model like COMBI is much more useful for complex behavior change challenges. COMBI has been developed by the University College London, and COMBI stands for the fact that a behavior is the result of three components, if you will: capability, opportunity, and motivation. And each of these is made of two subcomponents, but I'm going to give you an example in the next pages or so. And so when a project comes to us, the first thing that we consider is which model is going to be the most useful to tackle that challenge, including these two models. So just to give you an example of how COMBI works. So as it says, the behavior is a result of three components: capability, opportunity, and motivation. So the capability dimension is the ability for your audience, for individuals to actually perform the behavior, whether it's a physical ability or a psychological capability, or it could be a bit of both, depending on the context. But let's say, for instance, you want to encourage people to cycle to work. Obviously, the notion of can they ride a bike would be, do they have the energy to ride a bike would be the sort of questions that you would consider. And you can see there the sort of subcomponents of what we mean by physical ability, like physical skills, the strength, stamina, or psychological ability, things like knowledge, cognitive skills, or the ability to regulate your own behavior. So that's what capability is about. Opportunity is the context that enables the behavior to take place, and that could be either a material opportunity, so the physical context around the behavior, or the social context around the behavior. So things like time, do I have enough time? Do people have enough money? Does elements of the location itself make the behavior easier to perform? And at the social level, it could be things like social norms, peer pressure, and the culture we're in. So for instance, if you work for a company that's very pro people cycling to work, it might be easier for you to actually do it as well, compared to if you're in a company where this is not really a favorite, for instance. So capability and opportunity, what they do is basically set the stage for a behavior to take place. Ultimately, what's going to make the behavior happen is motivation. Do people have enough motivation to actually finally eventually do the behavior? And in this case, it's you've got two types of influences on people's motivation. Some of them more on the conscious reflective side, some others on the more unconscious automatic side. So things like having the intention is obviously a reflective process. It's something you think about and then you decide. Things like a habit is much more an automatic subconscious process, and you might not even think about it, although you perform that habit. And so coming back to our example of cycling to work, it could be that on one side, you have the intention to go, to cycle to work today. I should cycle to work today, but you might feel lazy and ultimately you might not do it. So there's very often a competition between these two types of influences, and ultimately, depending on the moment and the context you're in, it's going to go one way or the other. And so you can see that if we look at capability, opportunity, and motivation, it's giving us a more complete view of how to influence people, as opposed to just assuming that it's sufficient to simply motivate them to perform the behavior. So what we've done around models like these two is develop a methodology that basically brings a project from start to finish, from defining the objective to analyzing the context to defining a solution and ultimately implementing and evaluating whether what we've done is worked as well as we hoped it would work. So I'm not going to go into all of the details on this page. Maybe one thing to focus on is what's at the very top in bold. That's the explanation of the 4 phases, and we are going to unpack that for you in the next few slides. So the way that sort of project starts is by asking ourselves, what's the behavior that we want to influence? So first step is, let's focus on the behavior. And we want to identify, we want to qualify, and we want to specify a target behavior, which is the one that's going to drive the rest of the process. It's important because depending on the project that you might have in mind, the behavior that you want to focus on might be more or less defined. So let's say, for instance, you're a company and you have like 50 people working for you, and you want to make, you want to contribute to you want to become more of a sustainable company, and you want to invite your employees to use a reusable bottle. That's already quite defined as a behavior. But on the other end, you might be the city of Brussels or the Brussels region, and you want to get citizens to reduce their energy consumption, which is much more of a bigger, broader, complex challenge. And obviously, you're not going to approach these two type of challenges in the same way. Just to visualize that a bit more, what you can see on this slide is what's called a behavior system map for, in this specific case, for cycling in big cities. And what's interesting is when you start to consider how to influence the behavior of people cycling to work, for instance, you will quickly realize that there are different forces at play. There are different entry points that you could consider to start influencing the behavior of people cycling to work. You might want to influence the conversation taking place in media and culture, or you might want to influence the availability of cycling paths, or you might want to make sure that you provide people with the right helmets and machines, and so on and so on. So there are different ways you could contribute to that context. So it's important that that early on in the project you're very clear on the sort of the specific behavior or the specific behaviors. It could be more than one that you want to influence to get to the final result that you want. So one of the tools that we use, for instance, to help make that sort of choices, it's to consider the likelihood and the impact of a candidate behavior. So we want, ultimately, you want a behavior that's that people are very likely to do, and that's going to give you a big impact, or at least the best combination of these two dimensions. And so by comparing different candidate behaviors and rationalizing that process, you might be a better place to make the right choice. And ultimately, what you want is to have one specific behavior, or at least specify your target behaviors, like in this example that Julia can explain to you.
Yeah, so that's just an example that we're using for the purpose of this presentation. And in that case, it's in the context where you have a company that wants to encourage its staff to cycle to work more. So that's a very simple exercise, but that can teach you a lot about the specific of a behavior, and that can then help you select the right intervention to put in place. So for example, here, very simple question that we ask ourselves and the partners: who needs to do it? So in that context, it would be all company staff, all the staff of the company. What do they need to do? Cycle to work, very simple. When do they need to do it? We agreed on at least 1 day a week to start with. Where do they need to do it? On their way from work to work and back, obviously. And who do they need to do it with, either alone or with colleagues living nearby? And this can seem very simple, but that's already a way to reduce the number of intervention that we can choose later on to motivate this action.
Thanks, Julia. And so once that's defined, the next stage of the process is obviously to understand the context around the behavior that you want to influence. And the way we talk about it generally is to consider what we call barriers and enablers to that target behavior. And again, depending on the context you're in, you might have access to more or less data and insights. It could be that you're a smaller company and you will have to rely mostly on desk research, or you could have more resources at your disposal, and you might be able to do a range of research to bring you a fresh perspective. Again, it's the more you have, the better in general, but you shouldn't see that as a blocking point if you have access to less information. And again, if we consider our example of cycling in big cities, you can see in red and green the different influences on the different components of the behavior map. And so it's as important to understand the influences as it is to understand the different behaviors between them. So the way we tend to do it in general is, depending on the context, as I was saying, you might have access to more or less research to understand the context around your behavior. Something that we believe is remains very important, regardless of the context, is to do what we call an evidence review, which is to have a look at what the scientific literature has to say about that specific behavior, what seems to work, what seems to be the driving forces to it, what seems to be the barriers to it, what seem to be the enablers to it. And ideally, we want to combine that sort of a scientific input with your actual data and insights. And once we have all of that information, we basically filter it through the prism of the model, one or the other. And that helps you to not only understand, but then start to organize the insights and the information in a way that you're going to be a better place to act on it. So I'm not going to go into the details of it, but so that's just to give you an example of a live project in the context of littering in cities. And you can see that we identified through the evidence review, I think there is about 30 either barriers in red or enablers in green that contribute to increase or decrease littering behavior. And so obviously, once you have that view, which is organized according to the different dimensions of the model you use, it becomes very actionable, because let's say, for instance, that your challenge is a challenge of material opportunity, then that can lead you to a type of interventions later on. If your challenge is a challenge of conscious motivation, is going to lead you to a different path, and so on and so on. So coming back to our example, Julia.
Yeah. So for the purpose of this example, we used Combi, but as Fred mentioned, we have kind of a catalog of intervention that we can pick from. So we can sometimes do a mix of different ones. But for the purpose of this one, it's Combi, mixed as well with the literature, the relevant literature on the topic of cycling. And this has helped identify some of the barriers and enablers based on these three characteristics that are capability, opportunity, and motivation. So for example, capability, we found that one of the enabler that actually encourages people to cycle is to know the mental and physical benefits of cycling. That's an extra motivation for people to act. You then have also barriers, and when it comes to opportunity, you have just the fact that people have broken or unfunctional bikes. that seems very simple, but actually it can be a very big barrier to encouraging them to go to work cycling. And when it comes to motivation, for example, an unconscious motivation, that's more actually a non-motivation because it's a barrier, is the habit of driving to work. And this small habit can have a very big impact when you try to motivate cycling to work. Habits in general are a big barrier to the implementation of new behaviors. And in that case, it's a big one.
So at this point, you know what behavior you want to focus on, and you understand the context around that behavior. You understand what are the barriers to it and what are the enablers that could be capitalized on for the next phase. The next phase, which is about defining the solution. Defining solution is very much about selecting the right interventions that you want to use in the context of your solution. One way to think about the different types of interventions is very often when you work on a specific evidence review, let's say again littering, you're going to identify specific solutions that have worked elsewhere that you might want to consider for your own context. So, for instance, changing the color of bins in public parks, can have an influence on how people behave in terms of littering. So you might have these very specific solutions depending on your own context. In addition to that, what behavior science brings to the table is what we call a catalog of interventions that are perhaps a bit more generic, but once adapted correctly, could work in your context. So, for instance, in the example of littering, it could well be, and it is in this case, that communicating a social norm, which is that what other people do, will also have an influence on the target behavior that you're after. And so the way we tend to group these interventions, that you could see as active ingredients that you're going to place in your solution, is to think about them in terms of three types of intervention: contextual, internal, and social interventions. So contextual interventions are based on the fact that people are influenced by how things are presented to them. And so contextual intervention will be about how we present things in a certain way so that we can guide people's behavior in a certain way. Internal interventions are about the fact that there is a lot of processes going on inside people's mind when they decide, and obviously a lot of it is influenced by the fact that we have a limited mental capacity, and so we rely on a number of shortcuts, which sometimes mean that we make a suboptimal decision. And so again, that can be used in the right way to encourage sustainable behaviors. And the last one, extremely important as well, is social interventions. Is using the fact that people are influenced by the actions and approval of others, and therefore you can also use that sort of forces to encourage the right behaviors. So again, coming back to our example of getting your staff to cycle to work, Julia.
Yeah, so I only mentioned 3 of the lists that we had on the previous slide. So that's for this reason, is I'm just gonna dig deeper into some of this barrier. So the first one was the habit of driving to work. And here, looking at the catalog of intervention you have a very effective one, usually in terms of promoting environmental behaviors. For example, you have this goal setting is often applied to water and energy consumption, but could be applied here to cycling. And that could be, for example, practical example would be to suggest trying cycling to work on a specific day of the week. And here, if you had to translate this into practice, and that's where we use kind of our creativity in communications and marketing to put that into practice, that would be suggesting, for example, an internal campaign around Wednesday cycling, starting after New Year's Eve. So that's very specific, you would think, but that's actually based on research that shows that to break down people's habits, it's better to act within what is called a window of opportunity. So this window of opportunity opens itself, let's say, after a change here in either infrastructure or a big change in people's life. And usually over the year, it often happens after New Year's Eve with a good resolution. And that lasts about 3 months. So that's a good moment to implement creative campaign, actually. Another one would be also to create to use these social norms to encourage people to cycle together. And that again can be a big motivation for people, creating support groups within the staff, telling people that they could cycle with their colleagues on a specific day could also have a big impact. The second barrier was the broken or unfunctional bike. And here the intervention would be more focused on what we call restructuring the physical environment. But in that specific case, it would be mainly about helping people, making it easy for people to repair their bike. So that could be by offering vouchers to fix and repair their bike. That could also be by making sure that the necessary tools to repair the bike are available at home. And here you have the big bike revival as an example that was put in place in the UK over lockdown. And I think you got similar initiative going on in different countries, where basically it was people were encouraged to go and fix their bike, I think, for free, and really encouraged them to start cycling to work. And again, here, actually, COVID was one of these big windows of opportunity because it did disrupt people's daily life. And so it was a good moment to act and start implementing new behaviors. And the last example was an enabler this time. So the knowledge of the mental and physical benefits of cycling. And here, to prompt this, intervention could be around self-monitoring of the outcomes of the actions, in the case, self-monitoring of the benefits of cycling, by, for example, sending a monthly email to prompt the staff to assess the positive mental and physical changes that they're feeling since they started cycling. And it could be just more generally giving more information about the health consequences of cycling. And that could be combined as well with information on the fact that cycling also is good for the environment and decreases air pollution, and therefore is also good for health. And in that case, it could be a more traditional intervention through the display of posters, for example, that highlight the benefits of cycling instead of driving.
Okay, so the next phase is you have your behavior, we've analyzed the context around it, and importantly, we've defined the right interventions for it. I'm saying the right interventions because I guess one of the key added value of relying on behavioral science at that stage is very often if you consider a more, I guess, communication-based approach, you might have a lot of strategic thinking that goes into the first phase of analyzing the context and formulating a direction. But then when it comes to execution, it very much relies on people's opinions. In this case, you have the scientific tools to make what we think is a more robust sort of decision. But so once there, all of that needs to be mixed all together into a cohesive execution. And one way to think about it is you have the sort of, it's a bit of a sandwich approach, that goes both top down and bottom up. With on one side, you want to rely on, what communication science has to offer in terms of bringing cohesion to different elements of a program. And on the other side, as Julia has just explained, we want to distribute the best behavior intervention throughout the different elements of the program. And so ultimately it leads you to something like this, which is all of the different elements of the user journey, of the points of contacts and influence would have been defined and how they work together with what sort of interventions is going to be used where in that journey to ultimately influence people's behavior. It could be, for instance, from communications to, so if we think about the example, the littering example we were talking about, it could be interventions like, doing an advertising campaign to communicate the new rules in terms of how you should use, your bin bags. It could be changing the context in public parks and, adding more bins or changing the color of the bins and so on and so on. And so the idea is to bring all of this together into one plan and, with the clarity on what intervention is being used where, because ultimately that's what you want to measure, which leads us to the next point of evaluation. And although it sounds a bit perhaps surprising. Of course, we want to evaluate the impact of the program, but we also want to evaluate before that we want to evaluate the different ingredients that go into the final solution. So one of the tools we used is the API's criteria, which, depending on the context, are all of them or some of them particularly relevant to make sure that you design solutions that are going to be accepted by the people that you want to influence. For instance, we talked about vegetarian meat earlier in the presentation. It's very likely that there's a certain amount of things that we could do that would be acceptable by people when it comes to influencing them to eat vegetarian meat, but some of them might not be acceptable. So if at some point you think that creating a law to force people to eat meat only 3 days a week, it might be very effective, but it's unlikely to be acceptable. So you need to consider criteria like acceptability and affordability and so on when you design your solutions. And then when it comes to the impacting the final the impact of the program, that's going to be very specific to the project that you're working on. But essentially, you can consider 4 levels of evaluation. One would be to evaluate the input, for instance, the budget or the resource that you're dedicating to the project. It could be about evaluating the output. Let's say, for instance, you do a communications campaign. You want to know how many people have seen your campaign or have understood your campaign. You might also want to measure the outtake, the awareness of your campaign. And importantly, obviously, you want to measure the outcomes. So the change in actual behavior. So coming back to the example of littering, for instance, the city of Brussels, let's say that they do an intervention in public parks. They would want to measure the volume of littering that happens before the intervention takes place, during the interventions, and then at 2 points in time after the intervention, to see if it's worked and if it's working in the longer run. Last but not least, conscious of time, a couple of tools for encouraging sustainable behaviors, and actually some of them being quite specific to climate action. One thing that we believe is extremely important is to be as specific as possible when it comes to developing solutions. And one of the things that we are working on with an academic partner at the moment is to develop a set of cards for climate action. So think about the interventions like the one that Julia was talking about a few minutes ago in the cycling example, but ones that will be specific to climate action and that have been proven to be effective to encourage pro-climate behaviors. So that's going to be available a bit later in the year, but it's important that we keep developing the right tools for all of us to be able to do a better job at fighting climate change. And then more short-term and immediately available, we've just launched, some of you might be interested in this, we've just launched a newsletter about behavior change and sustainability, which is called Good Moves. It's going to exist in English and French, and so you can see the links there on the left if you want to subscribe. And the idea is that we want to bring scientists and experts into the discussion. We want to talk about research. We want to talk about case studies. And to give you an idea, we just launched it a couple of weeks ago, and the first one we interviewed Bas Verplanken from the University of Bath, who is one of the leading experts on habits. So he's got some interesting things to say about how habits can be, the relationship between habits and sustainable behaviors, for instance.